Hello, everybody. It's Helen Butler from Inspired People Solutions. Thank you for joining us today. We have one of our regular guests joining us, Angela Olanda from Zen HR Consulting joins us again. Hi, Ange.
Hi, Helen. How are you?
I'm good. Today, we are here to talk about more HR things, but with restrictions easing as the states come out of closing down schools. We've got schools reopening, we've got playgrounds reopening. It's a very staggered response back to some sort of normal. We thought it would be really paramount to bring you some of the things that we've been talking about, some of the things we're being asked about, but also touching on your safety and risk issues, employee experience, talking about the mental load and behaviours that potentially HR could be facing as a result of easing some restrictions and welcoming your employees back to the workforce and what that looks like for you from a HR perspective. So Ange and I have been answering some of your questions about those, but we thought we'd bring some of those to the table for you today so you could just listen to a quick potty and have a think about some things that you might be facing as a HR practitioner as restrictions start easing and your CEOs start wanting you to come back to the office and what you think, the things you need to be thinking out to get through this. So, and did you want to have a chat about, I guess, initially, what your thoughts are about some guiding principles that HR practitioners should be thinking about when restrictions are starting to ease? What should they be thinking about as part of their plan to chat to their senior execs about?
Yeah, definitely. I think really what we're looking at here is really a holistic approach to that employee experience. So when we're in a pandemic situation and there's a virus going around, we want to make sure that we're thinking about how that employee goes to work, what's their commute like, and also what their work experience is like. So what kind of experience they have when they're at work too. So the responsibilities that an employer would usually have on an employee would now look like extending to beyond that workplace environment and looking at that whole employee journey to and from work. So keeping that in mind, there's also the elements of managing that employee when they're back in the workplace as well. There's been a significant change in getting them out of the workplace for their safety. That happened quite rapidly, and there was some very quick adjustments needed for people individually. But then bringing them back into the workplace, looking at, well, how are we going to look at phasing that in or staggering that in such a way that people are not only physically prepared to do it, but mentally ready to do it.
Yeah.
So that means understanding what individual concerns are and having individual conversations with those workers, which if you're a HR manager or leader within a business of 100 employees, getting on the phone and calling 100 employees is probably a bit, a really very, very big expectation. So then as a HR leader or practitioner, you'd be looking at, well, how can I enable the leadership team or team leaders to facilitate those conversations with those workers directly, and giving your HR skills to those managers so that they can deliver on that in a way that is human, considerate and caring, so that any concerns and questions are answered, because there's going to be a lot of them, a lot of concerns shared by workers about coming back to the workplace.
It's really that, we talked offline before and you mentioned this is going to be a highly individualised return to work scenario for people. We've come across situations where, some people are enjoying the working from home experience and actually don't want to go back to the office full time, and that's been a surprise for some people. I've had some clients who have put surveys out to all of their workforce to see how the work from home experience has gone, and I would probably recommend that most HR people, if you haven't already done it, to do so, to see where your staff are at, and then you get a gauge of any safety issues potentially on the commute, like Ange was saying, any safety issues for the office, what they've enjoyed about working from home and what their ideal scenario will look like. And that gives you a good basis to actually start seeing where your workforce is at, what level of people want to come back to work. So it's a good basis to start thinking about your plans and what that conversation will look like. One of the other things that, as people, one of the other things that I've had come up, Ange, I'm certainly not in this group because I can't wait for my darling children to go back to school. But, with the return to work, and that's been staggered as we go, there will be some situations where employees wish to change their working arrangements, whether that be not just working from home like they have been and maybe mixing up their work from home days and their office days, but also potentially reducing hours, doing different roles, maybe job sharing with someone. So I've been talking to a few people about what that arrangement looks like, but from a HR perspective, what would be your advice to managers when they're having conversations with their employees about approaching or answering questions from employees about different requirements to their employment terms and conditions?
Definitely, it will be around listening to their concerns, so understanding their reasons as to why they feel they need to be want to work from home or adjust their working arrangements. I think some factors to keep in mind here is what kind of work they do. They are responsible for performing, and what supervisory requirements and expectations are placed upon them with regards to the work that they do. Also, looking at the delivery of whatever that job role is, how that meets the client's or customer needs, and factoring in overall as an organisation, does that fit in with our organisational plan? Connectedness, I think, is probably one big criticism or advantage. It's hard to know because whilst we're not physically looking at each other in an office environment, we're looking at each other when we're in our homes. So connectedness is happening in a different way where we're getting to know each other beyond our office attire, our office environment, and our lunch breaks and coffee breaks and things like that. So it has its pros and cons. So it will be really, really looking at weighing up what works for the business as well as the employee. What we've noticed in this, that your employees are your biggest assets. It's become more profound now than before, and I think there's a lot of gratefulness from CEOs and businesses in general about the commitment that employees have to the organisation. So, you want to be exploring how we can retain that loyalty and that commitment through looking at flexibility in a way that suits everyone's needs.
And I would say too, because there has been genuinely a spirit of wanting to do the right thing by everybody, and flexibility and camaraderie has been a really big part of helping everybody get through this pandemic, that ask your employees what they are looking for, what their ideal situation is, and if they do want to change, when it comes to negotiating that, ask them to put a business case forward, all the pros and cons for it, because, you're going to come up, like you said, you're going to come up with delivery of the job role, hours required, is it, client facing, all these things. Ask them to think through that, because they might very well come up with a very viable solution that solves all those questions for you. Something else we also talked about, and we did a podcast on it right at the beginning, was the behaviours of people. So not only have we whisked people off really quickly to save their lives and have them work from home and reduce their exposure to COVID-19, but now we're asking them to readjust. And we do cope quite well with change, I think, as long as we understand and are communicated to or with the consultant quite well. But, there were some behaviours, we talked about one, theft of hand sanitizer in the office was those things. And people now with restrictions easing and people coming out of isolation, the behaviours and the mental load on people could be changing quite a bit. And I think, I always approach a conversation with walk a mile in someone else's shoes, or, just to take a moment and think about what this means for that person. But what have you come across, or what's been some of your experiences or advice that you've given out to organisations or to some of your clients when there has been sort of potential behaviour issues, or people have just been acting in a way that's just not them because of the
Mm.
pandemic and their potential mental load that they've had to endure during this time?
Yeah, that's true. And that's certainly coming out in different ways. At the beginning of this pandemic, we saw a huge shift in our adjustment and somewhat shock to our system with what was happening for many people, everyone. And now we've kind of settled into this groove of not working in the workplace and a bit of a slowdown in our environment and the way we live. And now, there's, I don't know, is pressure the right word? I'm not sure. But the government is certainly now promoting employers and businesses to get back in business and to start opening your doors as they start introducing their easing of restrictions of social distancing. So, people who they've had to deal with the initial part, they've had to deal with getting used to their new working environment, which often is for people at home, and sometimes that's not always a safe environment for people or a conducive environment. And now there's but we've felt for the most people we've felt safe because we're actually not in the coalface of being out there in the commute to and from work. We're not out in the public as much, whereas now we're looking at opening our workplace doors and trying to get people back into the workplace for those businesses that feel that they need to, that it works for them.
Mm-hmm.
There will be an adjustment to that. So again, Helen, you mentioned this earlier when we were having our pre-chat about opening the doors and people now having to go through another change, mental adjustment to a new change, because when they're going back into those workplaces, they're going to be very different. There's going to be a lot of rules and regulations in place, and it's going to seem a bit strange, particularly if you need to be wearing a lot of personal protective equipment, potentially shields. You might find that your retail space has got a big perspex shield up all of a sudden. So there's going to be adjustments needed to that. We do generally cope well with change, and I think a lot of it comes down to how it's communicated, how businesses present those new working environments for the people, and so that there's that preparedness starting at the very beginning. So businesses are probably now looking at their business plans, which is great. So they'll be looking at how are we going to operate, how are we going to start increasing our revenue, how are we going to connect with our customers, what's our marketing strategy, what's our financial plans. From your human resources plan, that's going to be an overlay of what your business plan is. So how are you going to have your employees supporting that? So yeah, it's definitely around your communications.
Yeah.
And once you've got that plan in place, about communicating that so that there's an ease and adjustment to it.
Yeah.
I have worked with a case recently where at the very outset of the pandemic being announced, a worker basically for want of a better word, had a mental breakdown, and subsequently stayed out of the workplace, which was it was an essential service, but stayed out of the workplace for up to 8 weeks, and gave this story that they themselves had suffered from coronavirus, but wasn't supplying medical certificates to support it, which was causing all sorts of issues for the employer and what to pay this individual, and even know their whereabouts, because they were reluctant to give their next of kin details, and there was a whole big long story. I probably don't know if I'll go into it or not, but it seemed very believable and serious, but through some processes and working with the client on that, it came out that was all false, and that the employee had actually been going through a really significant mental breakdown, and didn't have a lot of family to support them, which then meant that the employer now stepped in to help get that person some help through a medical doctor and a psychologist to help really support them. And I think we might find that whilst we sort of dust off a little bit our process around working from home and getting back to the workplace, we might start noticing some people who haven't coped very well with these sudden changes. Employers need to be equipped to support them in that. And as I touched on earlier about having that individualized approach, asking some of those questions, how have you gone? Are you getting, I don't know if these are the right questions, but really sort of trying to understand how are they feeling about coming back to work? How have they coped? What support networks do they have around them? Do they know what to do can they recognize when they're not coping? And when they're not coping, do they know where to go to get some support? And then employers getting ready to have that support on hand for when employees start to emerge and re-enter the workforce.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I think the thing is too, like we touched on that particular story that you told us, and thank you for sharing, but there was also some really lovely context. Was that person had been a significant contributor to that business, like a long-standing employee,
yes
employee record, but just has had a moment during a very crazy time for our world where a hiccup occurred. And it's a very we talked about employee experience. Employees will remember how they are treated during this time. And I think most people have approached this pandemic with genuineness, a reasonableness, and in good faith. And that's why employees have, offered to reduce hours of work and just offered to help their employer, and vice versa. It's been a really collaborative approach, and we would really encourage you to continue with that good faith into these conversations. And if you choose to do a survey, see where things are at, then come up with a strategy and a communication plan to the business, but really equip your team leaders to have those quite serious but connected conversations with the employees, because you'll pick up a lot in that. And it's important for the employees to be engaged, consulted, but also felt as though they're brought along for the ride too, as restrictions ease and we head back into whatever the world is going to look like, which nobody knows at this point in time. But we're all in it for the long haul, trying to do the right thing. And we might call a stop to it here, because I think next week is going to see some more issues coming up.
Sure.
It'll be great. I think I'll be working on a plan next week, and just things to be aware of, just a little guide to help you through from a HR perspective, but also from a business planning and continuity point of view. You need to be prepared. So that'll go up on our website probably hopefully mid next week at the latest. But we'll have another podcast to talk about whatever else is going on in this crazy restrictions easing world, and hopefully, fingers crossed, wave 2 doesn't happen and you stay safe in Victoria, and keeps being sunny, fingers crossed. But as kids go back to school, that'll be another change, another adjustment. So please stay connected to your employees as much as you can, and take care of yourself.
Absolutely. Well said, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Ange.